She was 16 with a baby, and the whole school bullied her until we learned the truth. The first time I saw Alexis Monroe after she came back to school, she was standing in the doorway of our junior year English class, looking like she'd aged 5 years in the 4 months she'd been gone. Her clothes hung loose on a frame that had lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, dark circles shadowed eyes that used to sparkle when she laughed, and she carried herself like someone bracing for impact. Mrs. Holloway stopped mid-sentence about Fitzgerald's symbolism, and the entire classroom went silent. 28 pairs of eyes turning to stare at the girl who'd disappeared in September and was now returning in January with a reputation that had preceded her by weeks. Someone in the back row coughed out the word that had been circulating through Riverside High's hallways for days. Mom. The room erupted in barely suppressed laughter, and I watched Alexis's face flush red as she found an empty desk in the back corner and sat down without making eye contact with anyone. I'd known Alexis since middle school, not well, but enough to nod at in hallways and occasionally partner with for group projects. She'd been popular in the way that genuinely kind people often are, not the manufactured popularity of the drama-inclined crowd, but the easy likability that came from actually caring about people. She'd tutored struggling students, organized fundraisers for the animal shelter, always had tampons in her backpack for girls who needed them. Before she disappeared, I'd have described her as someone who made the world slightly better just by being in it. Now she sat hunched in that back corner, like she was trying to become invisible, while whispers and poorly hidden phone screens tracked her every movement. By lunch, someone had created a poll on Instagram asking whether she'd keep the baby or give it up for adoption. By the end of the day, someone else had photoshopped her face onto pregnancy announcement memes and circulated them through the junior class group chat. I didn't participate in the cruelty, but I didn't stop it either. I told myself it wasn't my business, that getting involved would just paint a target on my own back, that Alexis probably had friends who were supporting her privately. But I watched her eat lunch alone in the library that first week back, watched groups of girls who used to be her friends turn away when she approached, watched guys make crude comments about her body when she walked past in the hallways. The isolation was methodical and complete. Her social media accounts had been deactivated. I checked because I was curious about what had happened during those missing months, and the vacuum of her actual voice allowed rumors to flourish unchecked. Some said the father was her ex-boyfriend Trevor, who'd graduated last year. Others claimed it was some random hookup at a party. The most vicious rumors suggested she'd deliberately gotten pregnant to trap a guy into staying with her, and now he'd rightfully abandoned her to deal with the consequences alone. What struck me most wasn't the cruelty itself. High school had always been brutal to anyone who deviated from unspoken norms, but how the teachers participated in it through their silence and their pointed looks. Mrs. Holloway had moved Alexis to that back corner desk so she'd be more comfortable, which really meant so she wouldn't disrupt the class with her presence. Coach Hendricks had told her she couldn't take gym class anymore due to health concerns, even though Alexis looked perfectly capable of physical activity. Mr. Vance in biology had made a pointed comment during the reproduction unit about students who should have paid attention to this section before making life-altering mistakes, and the entire class had turned to stare at Alexis while she kept her eyes fixed on her textbook. The adults who were supposed to protect students from bullying were instead modeling that bullying was acceptable when directed at someone who'd made the right kind of mistake, one that confirmed their own moral superiority. I might never have gotten involved if it hadn't been for what happened 3 weeks after Alexis returned. I was cutting through the parking lot after school when I heard shouting near the athletic fields. A group of 6 or 7 guys from the football team had surrounded Alexis by the tennis courts, and one of them, Brian Coulter, the quarterback who thought his throwing arm made him God's gift to humanity, was filming her on his phone while asking increasingly graphic questions about her sex life. The other guys were laughing, shouting suggestions for questions, creating a wall that prevented her from leaving. Alexis stood in the center of that circle with tears streaming down her face, too scared or too broken to push past them. I don't know what made me walk over there. Some combination of disgust at their behavior and memory of Alexis helping me with algebra homework in 8th grade when I was struggling. I pushed through their circle and stood next to her, telling Brian to back off. Brian turned his phone toward me, smirking. "Look who's got a white knight complex. You trying to be daddy number 2, Nathan?" The other guys howled with laughter, but I kept my eyes on Brian and my voice steady. "Delete the video and walk away, or I'm reporting this to Principal Grayson as harassment." Brian's smirk faltered slightly. Grayson had a reputation for actually following through on disciplinary threats, and Brian's football scholarship dreams depended on maintaining a clean record. He made a show of deleting the video while his friends muttered about people not being able to take jokes anymore, then they dispersed. Alexis was shaking beside me, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold broken pieces together. I asked if she was okay. She laughed bitterly and said she hadn't been okay in 6 months. But thanks anyway. Then she walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing alone by the tennis courts, wondering what exactly I'd just witnessed. The next day, Brian and his friends made sure everyone knew I was now officially a social pariah too. Someone had drawn crude illustrations on my locker suggesting romantic involvement with Alexis. In the cafeteria, guys made exaggerated kissing sounds when I walked past. A few girls who'd previously been friendly gave me cold shoulders, as if defending someone from harassment made me contaminated by association. I'd always occupied a comfortable middle ground in Riverside High's social hierarchy, not popular enough to be invincible, but not vulnerable enough to be an obvious target. That protection evaporated overnight. But I also noticed something else. A handful of students started nodding at me in the hallways, small gestures of acknowledgement that suggested not everyone approved of how Alexis was being treated. One girl named Sophie Chen from my chemistry class stopped me after second period and said what I'd done was brave, that more people should stand up to Brian's bullshit. It was a small thing, but it mattered. Alexis started sitting with me at lunch, not because we were friends, but because we were both outcasts now, and there was safety in numbers of 2 instead of 1. Those first few lunches were awkward. What do you say to someone whose entire life has been dissected as public entertainment? I asked basic questions about her classes, avoided anything related to pregnancy or babies, tried to establish that I wasn't defending her because I expected something in return. She was guarded at first, responding in monosyllables, watching me like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. But gradually, over days and then weeks, she started talking more. About how hard junior year coursework was after missing 4 months. About her baby daughter, Emma, who was staying with her grandmother during school hours. About how exhausting it was to get up every 3 hours for feedings and still try to function in calculus class the next morning. About how her parents had wanted her to give Emma up for adoption, but she'd refused because Emma was the only good thing in her life right now. What she didn't talk about was the father. Every time the subject came close to that territory, she'd change topics or go quiet. I noticed that the rumors about Trevor being the father couldn't be accurate because Trevor had joined the army in June, 5 months before Emma would have been conceived. When I casually mentioned that timeline inconsistency, Alexis's face went pale and she made an excuse about needing to get to class early. It was the first real crack in the official story everyone was telling, and it made me start paying attention to what people weren't saying. Alexis's parents hadn't shown up to any school events since she'd come back. Her former best friend, Kayla, actively avoided her in hallways. But I'd seen Kayla crying in the bathroom once, which suggested more complicated emotions than simple disgust. And Alexis herself flinched whenever certain teachers walked past, particularly Mr. Damian Cross, the beloved drama teacher who directed school plays and was famous for his inspirational speeches about finding your authentic self. Mr. Cross was the kind of teacher students loved and parents trusted without question. He was in his early 30s, energetic and charismatic, always willing to stay late to help students rehearse lines or work through personal problems. He'd won Teacher of the Year twice and had transformed Riverside High's theater program into something that rivaled programs at much larger schools. Girls talked about how understanding he was, how he really listened to their problems instead of dismissing teenage concerns as trivial. Parents praised his dedication. I'd taken his introduction to theater class freshman year, and had been impressed by his genuine enthusiasm and the way he made even shy students feel comfortable performing. He seemed like exactly the kind of teacher every school needed more of. So, when I noticed Alexis actively avoiding being alone in hallways where his classroom was located, when I saw her take longer routes between classes to bypass that wing of the building entirely, I told myself I was reading too much into normal cautiousness. But then Sophie from chemistry class mentioned something that made me reconsider everything. We were lab partners working on a titration experiment when she asked if I'd noticed how Mr. Cross always picked certain girls for lead roles in plays, not necessarily the most talented performers, but a specific type, shy, slightly insecure, usually dealing with difficult home situations. Sophie said her older sister had been in drama club 4 years ago and had told her that Mr. Cross had a pattern of offering extra help and private coaching sessions to those particular girls. Nothing explicitly inappropriate, he was too smart for that. But her sister had felt uncomfortable with how much he wanted to know about their personal lives, how often he'd text them outside school hours, how he'd touch their shoulders or backs during rehearsals in ways that lasted just slightly too long. Sophie's sister had quit drama club halfway through senior year and refused to explain why. Their parents had assumed it was college application stress. Only years later had she told Sophie she'd felt like Mr. Cross was grooming her for something, but she'd never been able to point to any single action that was clearly wrong. I started watching Mr. Cross more carefully after that conversation, the way he'd rest his hand on the small of a student's back when talking to them, the way he'd compliment specific girls on their appearance in ways that seemed friendly but were just slightly too personal, the way he'd create opportunities to be alone with certain students by offering rides home or help with projects after school. And I noticed how Alexis physically recoiled the one time he'd tried to speak to her in the hallway, how she'd practically run away from him with panic written across her face. The pieces were arranging themselves into a picture I didn't want to see, but the picture was there, undeniable once you stopped looking away from it. Mr. Cross had access, opportunity, and trusted status. He'd selected vulnerable students and isolated them through special attention, and Alexis fit exactly the profile Sophie had described: shy, insecure, dealing with divorced parents, and a mother who worked double shifts. I didn't know what to do with this information. Suspicion wasn't proof. Sophie's sister's uncomfortable feelings weren't evidence. Alexis's avoidance behavior could be explained by pregnancy, making her feel self-conscious around all teachers. Going to administrators with vague concerns would accomplish nothing except making me look like I was spreading malicious rumors about a beloved teacher. But I couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't stop seeing the connections once they'd formed. So I did something I'm not proud of. I started following Alexis between classes, not in a creepy way, just maintaining loose awareness of her movements and watching who interacted with her. I told myself I was looking out for her after the Brian incident. Really, I was looking for evidence to confirm or deny my growing suspicions about Mr. Cross. What I saw confirmed everything. Alexis went out of her way to avoid the drama wing. When circumstances forced her past Mr. Cross's classroom, she'd wait until she saw him occupied with other students before hurrying past. Once I saw him catch sight of her in the hallway and start walking in her direction. The expression on Alexis's face was pure terror before she ducked into the nearest bathroom to avoid him. I caught up with Alexis after school that day and asked her directly. We were standing by her car in the parking lot, and I said, "It was Mr. Cross, wasn't it? He's Emma's father." The color drained from her face so completely I thought she might pass out. She started to deny it, mouth forming words that didn't come out, then just stood there shaking. I kept talking, voice low so nobody passing by could overhear. "You don't have to tell me anything, but if I'm right, you need to know that you weren't his only target. Sophie's sister felt uncomfortable around him 4 years ago. I've been watching how he interacts with students. The pattern is there." Alexis's legs gave out and she sat down hard on the pavement next to her car. Tears were streaming down her face, but she wasn't making any sound, just crying silently, like she'd learned to do it without drawing attention. I sat next to her and waited. Eventually, she started talking. Mr. Cross had noticed her during freshman year when she'd signed up for Introduction to Theater. She'd been struggling with her parents' divorce and her mother's depression, and Mr. Cross had been kind and supportive. He'd encouraged her to audition for the spring play, given her a small role, told her she had real talent. Sophomore year, she'd gotten a bigger role in the fall production. Mr. Cross had offered extra rehearsal sessions after school, just the two of them in the empty auditorium. He'd talked about his own difficult childhood, about how theater had saved him, created this sense of shared understanding and special connection. He'd started texting her, nothing inappropriate at first, just checking in about homework and family stuff. He'd given her rides home when her mom was working late. He'd been exactly what she'd needed, an adult who cared, who listened, who made her feel important. She'd trusted him completely. The grooming had been so gradual she hadn't recognized it was happening until it was too late. The actual assault had occurred last March during spring break. Alexis had been helping Mr. Cross organize props in the theater storage room. Nobody else was in the building. He'd made sure of that by scheduling the session for a day when he knew the school would be empty. He'd locked the door and told her he had feelings for her, that she was mature for her age, that what they had was special. She'd tried to leave, and he'd blocked the door. She'd said no, and he'd told her she was confused about what she really wanted. Then he'd raped her in that storage room while she cried, and said no over and over until she stopped saying anything at all. Afterward, he'd told her that nobody would believe her if she told anyone. He was a respected teacher with a spotless record. She was a teenage girl with divorced parents and a reputation for being dramatic. If she accused him, he'd make sure everyone knew she'd been the one pursuing him, that she'd been obsessed and had fabricated a story when he'd rejected her advances. He'd destroy her life and her mother's career. Her mom was a nurse at the local hospital where Mr. Cross's wife also worked. Everything would come out. Everyone would blame Alexis. So she'd stayed silent. She'd quit drama club with a vague excuse about focusing on academics. She'd tried to avoid Mr. Cross, but in a school of 800 students, you couldn't avoid anyone completely. She'd see him in hallways or at assemblies, and he'd smile at her like nothing had happened, like he hadn't destroyed her entire sense of safety and self. When she'd realized she was pregnant in June, she'd been paralyzed with terror. Her mother had been furious, demanding to know who the father was. Alexis had said it was Trevor, her ex-boyfriend who'd already left for Army basic training. Trevor couldn't contradict the story because he was at Fort Benning without phone access. Her mother had pressured her to get an abortion or give the baby up for adoption. Alexis had refused because terminating the pregnancy felt like giving Mr. Cross even more power over her body, and adoption felt like abandoning the only thing that was truly hers. So she'd left school in September for home education, had Emma in November, and returned in January because her mother couldn't afford childcare and tutoring simultaneously. And now she was back in the same building as her rapist, pretending everything was fine while he continued teaching, and everyone blamed her for her own victimization. I sat there listening to Alexis's story and felt rage burning so hot I couldn't speak. This wasn't some complicated situation with ambiguous consent. Mr. Cross was a predator who'd systematically groomed and assaulted a student, then used his position of authority to silence her. And Riverside High had given him everything he needed to operate: unsupervised access to students, community trust, and a culture that automatically blamed girls for any sexual situation that became public. The adults in charge had failed so catastrophically that Alexis was being tortured daily for being raped, while her rapist directed the spring musical and received parent donations for theater program supplies. I asked Alexis why she hadn't reported him after Emma was born, when she had physical evidence of his crime. She laughed bitterly and said evidence of pregnancy wasn't evidence of rape. Mr. Cross would claim it was consensual, that she'd pursued him, that he'd made a mistake, but she'd been the instigator. Who would people believe? The respected teacher or the teen mom who'd already been labeled a slut by the entire student body? I understood her fear, but I also knew that staying silent meant Mr. Cross would continue hurting students. Sophie's sister had been targeted 4 years ago. Alexis had been assaulted last year. How many others in between? How many since? I told Alexis that she wasn't responsible for his future victims, but we had the power to stop him if she was willing to fight. She asked what fighting would accomplish besides making everything worse. I said I didn't know, but doing nothing guaranteed he'd hurt someone else. We sat in that parking lot until the sun started setting, talking through options that all seemed insufficient or impossible. Finally, Alexis said she'd think about it, but she made me promise not to tell anyone what she'd shared. Not Sophie, not administrators, nobody. This was her story to tell or not tell. I promised, even though it felt like swallowing broken glass to stay silent about what I now knew. That night, I lay awake researching sexual assault laws and mandatory reporting requirements and statute of limitations, trying to find some legal avenue that would protect Alexis while holding Mr. Cross accountable. The next day, I approached Sophie and asked if her sister would be willing to talk to me. Sophie was immediately suspicious, asking why I wanted to contact her. I couldn't tell her the truth without breaking my promise to Alexis, so I said I was concerned about certain patterns I'd noticed with Mr. Cross and wanted to understand if my concerns were valid. Sophie studied me for a long moment, then wrote down her sister's phone number. She said Maya was in college now, studying psychology, and she'd told Sophie recently that she regretted not speaking up when she'd felt uncomfortable around Mr. Cross. Maybe she'd be willing to talk now. I texted Maya that evening, introduced myself awkwardly, and asked if she'd be willing to discuss her experience in Riverside High's drama program. She called me back within an hour. Her voice was wary but also eager, like she'd been waiting years for someone to ask the right questions. She said Mr. Cross had groomed her exactly the way he'd groomed others: special attention, private rehearsals, inappropriate compliments, gradually escalating physical contact. He'd never assaulted her because she'd had a boyfriend who'd insisted on picking her up after rehearsals, limiting Mr. Cross's access to her alone. But she'd watched him select other girls who were more isolated, and she'd felt guilty for years that she hadn't said anything when the patterns were so obvious. Maya said there was another girl from her year, Jennifer, who'd transferred to a different school halfway through senior year. The official explanation had been family relocation, but Maya suspected something had happened with Mr. Cross. Jennifer had been one of his favorites, lead role in the fall play, constantly staying after for extra help, and then suddenly she was gone. Maya had her phone number if I wanted to try reaching out. I thanked her and spent the rest of the evening trying to figure out how to have this conversation with someone I'd never met. Eventually, I sent Jennifer a careful text, explaining that I was a current Riverside High student investigating concerns about a teacher, and I'd heard she'd been in drama club. Could she spare a few minutes to talk? She responded the next morning with a phone number and a time. When I called, Jennifer's voice was tight with anxiety. She asked me to confirm exactly what I was investigating. I said I had reason to believe Mr. Cross was sexually inappropriate with students. There was silence on the line for several seconds. Then Jennifer started crying. Mr. Cross had raped her in his car after a rehearsal the fall of her senior year. She'd told her parents, and they'd gone to Principal Grayson. Grayson had expressed deep concern and promised a full investigation. Then Mr. Cross had produced text messages that Jennifer had sent him. Messages that he'd manipulated her into sending by creating situations where she felt obligated to thank him for his help and support. Out of context, those messages looked like a student expressing romantic interest in a teacher. Mr. Cross had claimed Jennifer had developed an inappropriate crush on him, that he'd tried to handle it gently by maintaining professional distance, and that she'd become angry when he'd set boundaries. He'd suggested she was fabricating assault claims out of revenge for rejection. The school board had hired an outside investigator who'd interviewed both parties. The investigator had concluded that the evidence was inconclusive and that Jennifer's claims couldn't be substantiated. The official finding was that no assault had occurred, but Mr. Cross had shown poor judgment in communicating with a student outside school hours. He'd received a written warning. Jennifer's parents had been told their daughter's allegations were unfounded, and if they pursued the matter further, they could be sued for defamation. The family had moved to another district rather than continue fighting a battle they were clearly going to lose. I sat holding my phone after Jennifer hung up, trying to process the implications of what she'd told me. This wasn't a case of suspected predatory behavior. It was documented predatory behavior that had been investigated and deliberately covered up. Riverside High's administration knew Mr. Cross was dangerous and had chosen to protect him anyway, which meant going through official channels would accomplish nothing. Grayson had already demonstrated that he'd prioritized the school's reputation over student safety. I thought about telling my parents, but they'd immediately contact administrators, which would trigger the same protective response that had failed Jennifer. I thought about calling the police, but without Alexis's cooperation, I had nothing but second-hand accounts and suspicions. Everything led back to Alexis, and whether she was willing to come forward, despite knowing the system had already failed one victim. I went to find her the next day during lunch. She was in the library, doing calculus homework while eating a sandwich. I sat down across from her and said we needed to talk. Then I told her everything. Maya's experience, Jennifer's assault, and the subsequent cover-up, the pattern spanning at least 4 years. The knowledge that if we did nothing, there would absolutely be more victims. Alexis's face cycled through shock, anger, and resignation. She asked what I expected her to do with this information. I said I expected nothing. This was her choice to make, but I could help her document everything if she decided to report. We could gather statements from Maya and Jennifer, create a timeline showing the pattern, demonstrate that Mr. Cross was a serial predator rather than a teacher who'd made one mistake. It wouldn't guarantee justice, but it would be harder to dismiss than one girl's word against a beloved teacher. Alexis was quiet for a long time, staring at her calculus textbook without seeing it. Then she said she needed to talk to her mother first, that she couldn't do this without parental support. I said I understood, and gave her Maya's and Jennifer's contact information in case she wanted to hear their stories directly. Then I left her alone to make what I knew was the hardest decision of her life. Either stay silent and safe, or speak up and risk everything while probably accomplishing nothing. I didn't envy her that choice. I also knew that I'd already made my own choice. If Alexis decided to fight, I was fighting with her regardless of what it cost me. 3 days passed without any word from Alexis. She wasn't at school, and I worried that I'd pushed too hard and driven her away entirely. Then on Thursday evening, she texted asking me to come to her house. I drove over after dinner, nervous about what I'd find. Alexis lived in a small ranch house on the outskirts of town with peeling paint and an overgrown yard. Her mother answered the door looking exhausted and suspicious. She asked who I was and what I wanted with her daughter. I introduced myself and said Alexis had asked me to come over. Mrs. Monroe studied me with the assessing gaze of someone who'd learned not to trust easily, then let me in. Alexis was in the living room holding Emma, who was sleeping peacefully against her shoulder. Alexis's eyes were red from crying, but her jaw was set with determination I'd never seen before. She said she'd decided to report Mr. Cross, but she needed help building a case strong enough that they couldn't dismiss it. Her mother was supporting her, which had made all the difference. Mrs. Monroe apologized for not believing Alexis initially when she'd finally admitted the truth about Emma's father. She'd been so angry about the pregnancy that she hadn't listened to what her daughter was actually saying. Now she was ready to fight. We spent the next 2 weeks building a case. Maya agreed to provide a written statement detailing Mr. Cross's grooming behavior toward her. Jennifer did the same and provided copies of the text messages Mr. Cross had manipulated her into sending, along with the school's investigation findings that showed administrators knew he was inappropriate with students. I created a detailed timeline showing the pattern of Mr. Cross targeting vulnerable girls in drama club across multiple years. Sophie helped me identify 4 other girls from the past 3 years who'd suddenly quit drama club without explanation. 2 of them were willing to talk. Both described similar grooming tactics and boundary violations, though neither had been assaulted. The pattern was undeniable. I also started documenting Mr. Cross's current behavior, taking note of which students he gave rides home to, which ones he texted outside school hours, which ones he kept after for extra help when the building was empty. Everything went into a binder that grew thicker with each passing day. We weren't just reporting an assault anymore. We were exposing a systematic predator who'd operated for years with institutional protection. Alexis arranged for a paternity test to establish definitively that Mr. Cross was Emma's biological father. The results came back with 99.9% probability of paternity. That single piece of paper transformed Alexis's story from an unprovable accusation into documented fact. Mr. Cross had impregnated a student he'd had authority over. Even if he claimed it was consensual, which was a legal impossibility given their power differential and her age when it occurred, it was still statutory rape and abuse of his position. With that evidence secured, Mrs. Monroe contacted a lawyer who specialized in sexual assault cases. The lawyer reviewed everything we'd compiled and said we had a solid foundation. She recommended reporting to both the school board and the police simultaneously, so administrators couldn't bury it like they'd done with Jennifer's case. On a Monday morning in late March, almost exactly 1 year after Mr. Cross had assaulted Alexis, we walked into Principal Grayson's office with the lawyer, the binder of evidence, and the paternity test results. Grayson's face went from annoyed at the interruption to alarmed as the lawyer explained why we were there. The lawyer laid out the case methodically. A teacher had sexually assaulted a student on school grounds, impregnated her, and then continued teaching while the victim was blamed and ostracized by the school community. The paternity test proved Mr. Cross was Emma's father. Multiple witnesses documented a pattern of grooming and inappropriate behavior spanning years. A previous victim had reported assault and been dismissed in an investigation that found Mr. Cross guilty of poor judgment but took no meaningful action. The school district was liable for maintaining an unsafe environment and failing to protect students from a known predator. If they didn't take immediate action, suspending Mr. Cross, conducting a genuine investigation, and implementing new safeguards, the lawyer would be filing lawsuits against both Mr. Cross and the district for negligence and enabling abuse. Grayson tried to protest that this was the first he was hearing of serious concerns about Mr. Cross. The lawyer pulled out Jennifer's case file, which documented that Grayson had personally overseen that investigation. He'd known Mr. Cross was dangerous for years and had done nothing. His face went pale. Grayson called an emergency meeting with the superintendent and the school board. We spent 4 hours in a conference room going through every piece of evidence, while school administrators tried various strategies to minimize the situation. They questioned Alexis's credibility. They suggested the paternity test could be mistaken. They claimed the previous investigation had been thorough and had found insufficient evidence. They argued that Mr. Cross's reputation and years of service deserved consideration. The lawyer demolished each deflection systematically. Paternity tests weren't mistaken at 99.9% probability. Previous investigations had been deliberately superficial. A teacher's reputation didn't outweigh student safety. Multiple victims following the same pattern wasn't coincidence. By the end of the meeting, the superintendent had agreed to place Mr. Cross on immediate administrative leave, pending a full investigation. Police were contacted. The school board agreed to hire an independent investigator with no connections to the district. It wasn't justice yet, but it was progress. Alexis squeezed my hand when we left that conference room, and I saw something I hadn't seen in her face since she'd returned to school: hope. The news spread through Riverside High within hours. Someone in administration must have leaked it, because by the end of the school day, everyone knew Mr. Cross had been placed on leave for allegations of inappropriate conduct with students. The rumor mill churned with speculation and conspiracy theories. Some students immediately believed it and shared their own stories of feeling uncomfortable around Mr. Cross. Others defended him furiously, claiming this was a witch hunt or a misunderstanding. The drama club kids were divided between loyalty to a teacher they'd admired and dawning horror at patterns they'd witnessed but hadn't named. Brian Coulter actually apologized to Alexis in the cafeteria, saying he'd been a complete asshole, and he was sorry for how he'd treated her. Kayla, Alexis's former best friend, broke down crying and admitted she'd abandoned Alexis because she'd been jealous of Mr. Cross's attention to her and had convinced herself Alexis was trying to seduce him. The realization that she'd blamed her friend for being groomed and assaulted had destroyed her. Not everyone apologized. Some students doubled down on defending Mr. Cross. Some said Alexis was lying for attention or money. Some claimed she was exaggerating consensual interactions into assault allegations, but enough people believed her that the social isolation began to crack. Students started sitting with us at lunch again. Teachers who'd been dismissive apologized. The junior class group chat that had been filled with cruel memes about Alexis was now filled with messages of support. The police investigation moved forward with competence that surprised me given my cynicism about institutional responses. Detective Lisa Hammond, who specialized in sex crimes against minors, interviewed Alexis, Maya, Jennifer, and the other girls who'd come forward. She obtained Mr. Cross's phone records and found hundreds of text messages to students outside school hours, many sent late at night, many with content that was clearly inappropriate. She interviewed current drama club students and uncovered 2 more girls Mr. Cross had been grooming with the same tactics he'd used on Alexis. One was a freshman who'd been grateful for the attention until other students told her about the allegations, and she'd realized what was actually happening. The other was a junior who'd already been assaulted twice, but had been too terrified to report until she learned others had come forward. With each new victim who spoke up, the case against Mr. Cross became more overwhelming. He hired an expensive defense attorney who tried to paint this as a conspiracy of troubled girls with grudges against a caring teacher. But the physical evidence and the pattern across years made that argument untenable. Mr. Cross was arrested in April and charged with multiple counts of sexual assault, statutory rape, and abuse of authority. The trial took place the following fall. I was 18 by then, starting senior year, and I'd been subpoenaed to testify about the investigation I'd conducted and the evidence I'd compiled. Walking into that courtroom and seeing Mr. Cross sitting at the defense table in an expensive suit, looking indignant rather than ashamed, made me understand why victims often couldn't face their abusers in court. He still carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed he'd done nothing wrong, that he was the real victim of overzealous prosecution and vengeful teenage girls. His attorney tried to portray him as a dedicated teacher whose kindness had been misinterpreted by troubled students. He pointed to Mr. Cross's awards, his spotless record, the parents who testified about his positive influence on their children. He tried to introduce evidence of Alexis's social media posts from sophomore year as proof she'd been promiscuous, and therefore couldn't be trusted about consent. The prosecution systematically destroyed each argument. The paternity test was irrefutable proof of sexual contact. The pattern across multiple victims demonstrated deliberate predatory behavior. The text messages and witness statements showed methodical grooming. Alexis's sexual history was irrelevant because she'd been 15 when a 32-year-old man in a position of authority had assaulted her. When Alexis took the stand, the courtroom was completely silent. She'd been preparing for this testimony for months, working with the prosecutor and a victim advocate to be ready for the defense attorney's attacks. She spoke clearly and calmly, describing Mr. Cross's grooming tactics, the assault itself, his threats afterward, and the pregnancy that resulted. The defense attorney tried to rattle her with questions about why she'd initially lied about the father's identity, why she hadn't reported immediately, why she'd continued attending school where Mr. Cross taught. Alexis answered each question steadily. She'd lied because she was terrified and he'd threatened her. She hadn't reported because he'd convinced her nobody would believe her. She'd continued at Riverside High because her family couldn't afford private school, and she refused to let him steal her education, along with everything else. The jury watched her with expressions ranging from sympathy to anger, but nobody looked skeptical. When the prosecutor played portions of Mr. Cross's text messages to students, messages that were manipulative and clearly boundary-violating, several jury members visibly flinched. The defense tried to argue those were simply a caring teacher checking on struggling students, but the pattern, the late-night timing, the way he'd isolated certain girls, made his true intentions obvious. Jennifer, too, testified about her assault and the school's inadequate response. Maya testified about the grooming she'd experienced and witnessed. The freshman Mr. Cross had been grooming testified about his inappropriate comments and touches. Each victim added another piece to the portrait of a man who'd systematically abused his position for years while maintaining a facade of being the perfect teacher. The prosecution brought in an expert on sexual grooming who explained how predators identified vulnerable victims, isolated them through special attention, gradually normalized inappropriate behavior, and used power dynamics to silence disclosure. Every tactic she described matched Mr. Cross's documented behavior. The defense couldn't counter it. They tried arguing that Mr. Cross had made mistakes in judgment but hadn't committed crimes. They tried suggesting cultural differences in how some people express care. They tried everything except admitting what the evidence made undeniable. Their client was a predator who'd been raping students for years. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They found Mr. Cross guilty on all counts. When the verdict was read, Alexis started crying silently. Not from relief, the trauma doesn't disappear with a guilty verdict, but from the validation of finally being believed. Emma was sitting on Mrs. Monroe's lap in the gallery, too young to understand, but old enough to sense her mother's emotions. I watched Mr. Cross's face as the guilty verdicts were announced, and he looked genuinely confused, like he still couldn't understand why anyone thought he'd done something wrong. Sentencing happened 2 months later. The prosecutor asked for the maximum penalty, 20 years in prison with no possibility of parole. The defense argued for leniency, claiming Mr. Cross had already lost his career and reputation. Multiple victims gave impact statements. Alexis spoke about being 16 years old and pregnant by the teacher she'd trusted, about the social isolation and cruelty she'd endured, about raising Emma alone while her rapist continued teaching other students. Jennifer spoke about dropping out of college her freshman year because the trauma made it impossible to function, about years of therapy trying to rebuild her sense of safety. Maya spoke about the guilt she still carried for not speaking up when the patterns were obvious. The judge listened to everything, then sentenced Mr. Cross to 18 years in prison. Not the maximum, but substantial. He'd be in his early 50s when released. His teaching career permanently destroyed, his reputation ruined. It wasn't justice. Nothing could undo what he'd done, but it was accountability. Emma would be 18 when he got out. Old enough to know her biological father was in prison for raping her mother. Old enough to understand exactly what he was. The district settled civil lawsuits with Alexis, Jennifer, and 3 other victims for undisclosed amounts. Principal Grayson was forced to resign. The school board implemented new policies about teacher-student communication, mandatory reporting training, and independent investigations of abuse allegations. Riverside High hired a full-time counselor who specialized in sexual assault trauma. None of these changes brought back the years victims had lost or healed the damage that had been done, but they meant future students might be safer. The cultural shift at school was slower but real. Teachers became more aware of inappropriate boundaries. Students started questioning the worship of charismatic adults. The drama program struggled for a year with interim directors before hiring someone who prioritized safety alongside artistic excellence. Alexis graduated on time, despite everything, walked across that stage with honors cords, and got accepted to several colleges with full scholarships. She decided to take a gap year to work and save money and spend time with Emma before starting school. Last I heard, she was planning to study social work, wanting to help other survivors navigate the systems that had nearly failed her. As for me, I learned that courage isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just sitting with someone while they cry. Sometimes it's making phone calls to strangers and asking difficult questions. Sometimes it's showing up when it would be easier to look away. I also learned that justice is fragile and imperfect, dependent on victims being willing to come forward despite knowing the system usually protects predators. That investigation worked because Alexis was brave enough to fight, because Jennifer had documented everything, because Maya kept speaking up when nobody listened. It worked because we built such an overwhelming case that even administrators who wanted to protect Mr. Cross couldn't dismiss it. Most importantly, I learned that the students everyone's dismissing as sluts or troublemakers or liars are often just victims with no power and no protection. Alexis was 16 with a baby, and everyone assumed the worst about her character while celebrating the teacher who'd raped her. The cruelty she endured said everything about our willingness to blame victims and nothing about who she actually was. She was the strongest person I've ever known, raising Emma with fierce love while fighting a battle she should never have had to fight. 3 years later, Emma's a happy kid who doesn't know yet what her mother survived to give her a safe life. Maybe someday Alexis will tell her, or maybe Emma will just grow up knowing her mother is someone who doesn't quit when things get impossible. Either way, she'll know the truth eventually, that her father is a monster, that her mother is a hero, and that sometimes the whole school has to learn the hard way that their assumptions about who deserves compassion are catastrophically wrong. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.